Hello everyone and welcome to our first in the series of this year's Summer of Safety Lives. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Cheryl Johns from beta member Livery List, and we're going to talk about biosecurity and why you need to take precautions both in the yard and when you're out travelling with your horse over the summer. Cheryl, thank you very much for joining me again.
No problem.
So when we talk about biosecurity, I think a lot of people are unsure exactly what we mean. Tell us what we mean by biosecurity. What is it?
So obviously equines are susceptible to certain types of infectious disease, strangles, equine influenza, many others. They're probably the most common too. And basically when we talk about biosecurity, it is protecting the health of the equines in our care in terms of taking precautions to make sure that you're minimizing the risk that they could come into contact or spread such diseases. A lot of people, I think, when they hear biosecurity, think it's sort of hazmat suits and a lot of cost and a lot of hassle. But there's a whole spectrum of steps that you can take to protect the horses in your care. You can go fully down the isolating new arrivals, isolating after events, completely separate everything, dedicated staff, dedicated tools, enforcing the need for certain vaccinations such as flu, influenza, asking for scopes or strangles tests when new horses come on the yard. But at the other end, you can also take very basic precautions, which are better than none, such as you can do temperature testing when you have new horses coming onto the yard. Keeping them separate is always sensible. But temperature testing will definitely help you pick up any signs of fever, which is an obvious potential, not always, but a potential sign that should ring alarm bells that there may be something going on. That's obviously much easier for horses arriving back from events as well. So if you have existing liveries that come on, obviously they will have been off mixing with horses, and a lot of yards and horse owners will just turn them straight back out in the paddock, straight back out in the yard, which obviously if they've come into contact with anything can be quite dangerous. So overall, that was a very long answer, but biosecurity is basically protecting the horses in our care from catching such diseases. It's part of the duty of care of good welfare standards and good welfare practices. And it obviously protects everybody. It protects the individual horses, the entire herd on the yard as a collective. It protects the yard from the outcomes of an outbreak, and it protects the horse owners as well from obviously the cost and hassle if there were an outbreak, and then that results in the yard having to be locked down and testing and all extra costs.
Yeah, now there's a lot in there, but maybe we can unpick some of the detail. So I think for those who are in a small yard, maybe their own yard as well as in a larger livery yard, does the same apply? Is it something that a horse owner should take responsibility for, or should they just think, no, it only applies if I'm in a big yard, it's somebody else's responsibility?
I think it applies whatever size your yard is, whether you've got a couple of horses, a majority might be your own, for example, you might only have one or two liveries at a yard at your house, or you could be a massive equestrian centre with 80 horses on site, a riding school, hold events, have people going here, there and everywhere to competitions and training. And my opinion is that it should be considered one and the same for all. It only takes one horse to catch strangles. It only takes one horse to have strangles so badly that it results in it dying, which does happen. Obviously, there's a higher risk of it spreading on a larger yard, but equally each horse is an individual and each horse should be treated the same. So when it comes down to the responsibility, ultimately it is the horse owner's responsibility because they are the owner of that horse and they're the decision maker, but it will also be determined by the yard that you're on. So you may have massive equestrian centres that don't actually have any biosecurity policies or procedures in place, but you may have a small DIY yard that is absolute belt and braces, needs strangles testing, wants temperature testing done. It will very much be on a yard to yard basis. It's kind of a collaboration, I suppose, between the yard's expectations and the horse owners. It has to be a collective thing. Everybody has to work together, the yard owner and the horse owner.
Oh, I mean, that seems a silly question, presumably, but do you have the right, when you move into a new yard, should you be asking the yard owner questions around their attitude towards biosecurity?
Definitely. I don't think enough horse owners do. I think a lot of horse owners don't ask enough questions when they look for a new yard. A lot of it is, especially at the moment, cost-based. Biosecurity is definitely amongst the questions that they should be asking. Particularly, I mean, the yard should be forthcoming. If it is a yard that has good biosecurity procedures or policies, they should be open with anybody looking at the yard and saying, I expect the horse to be vaccinated against equine influenza. I like all horses to be tested for strangles when they come in. There's a week or 2 week or 3 week isolation period or temperature testing. Unfortunately, a lot of horse owners seem to be turned off of yards that mention biosecurity, when I think it should actually be the other way around. Horse owners should be wanting yards to be prioritising biosecurity, because at the end of the day, that's showing proactive steps that are protecting the horses in their care on that yard, which again is in everybody's interests. But yeah, definitely horse owners should be asking. If a yard owner doesn't mention it, horse owners should at least be asking, what is your new arrivals procedure? Do I just arrive and throw my horse out in the field with everybody else and it goes on its merry way? Or, do I have to do X, Y, and Z? And it should definitely be a discussion. And I don't think on both sides, yard owners and horse owners, I don't think that it's discussed enough. I think biosecurity still has a lot of sort of stigma attached to it, and more people tend to see it as a hindrance than a benefit, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's a barrier rather than a gateway. So it's a barrier to something rather than being a gateway. And then you mentioned temperature testing, and I know from work we've done with Red Wings how important they see temperature testing.
Yeah.
Why is temperature testing, ongoing temperature testing, so important?
It's first and foremost, you need to understand what the normal temperature of a horse is. If you don't understand what its normal resting temperature is, you won't have, well, you obviously would if it was incredibly high, but a couple of degrees or points of a degree can actually make all the difference if a horse has perhaps a lower resting temperature than what would be deemed normal. So first and foremost, it's important to understand what the normal temperature of a horse is. And then ongoing temperature testing. So, for example, when you come back from an event, check every day what the temperature is and compare it to the normal. You can do random temperature testing on horses in the yard if, at any moment in time, or if you've got any suspicions that they might be showing other symptoms, and perhaps you want to do the temperature testing kind of as a bit of an investigatory procedure to have a look. But most importantly, it's just a good practice to be in. So it's very easy. It's a thermometer and you take their temperature. It takes seconds. It's not hard. I've worked with Red Wings as well I've worked on their Strangles Awareness Week every year with them. And I played a big part in their temperature testing campaigns that they've done over the last few years. And we found it really surprising how many yard owners and horse owners actually didn't know how to take the temperature of a horse, or have never taken the temperature of a horse. So that's the very first thing to do, is to make sure that's a procedure that you know how to carry out properly and safely and effectively. But it should just become part of the yard routine. A horse goes to an event, it comes back, you temperature test for a few days, make sure that it's normal, understanding what that horse's normal temperature is. And it's really easy. If the horse's temperature is high and it's showing signs of a fever, you can then go on to the next step of your biosecurity procedure, which may be then isolating it, seeing if there's any other symptoms that come out, continue with the temperature testing, because it might just be a complete random anomaly. But it's the very first thing that should be done. But if you don't know the normal resting temperature of a horse, then temperature testing could be misleading. So it's just important to have it as a good procedure, and knowing that people understand the how and the why and what it should be in terms of results.
And I think you're right. A lot of people don't. And yeah, and I know Red Wings has some videos available that you can watch to actually see how to do it. I think that's really important. You're talking about isolation yards, and I know that is a procedure in a lot of big yards is that they have a separate area of the yard where they can put horses to keep them away. What if you're either keeping horses somewhere where there aren't a lot of stables? What can you do if you don't have the luxury of an isolation yard?
If it's the summer and the weather's nice, you can easily set up a separate paddock. Even if it's in the vicinity of other horses, say you don't have the luxury of putting it 2 fields away, you can double tape. So you can do another interior line of tape to make sure that the horses can't reach over, and nose-to-nose contact is basically what you want to avoid. And things like just making sure that you keep everything separate. So don't be sharing water buckets if you don't have, for example, an automatic trough in the field, making sure that that horse has its own things that it's using, its own grooming kit, its own buckets for water, for feed, its own hay nets. Obviously out in the paddock, it's a lot easier because you're out in the fresh air and there's a lot more space. If you're on a yard, like you say, it's a lot more difficult. There's very few yards that have dedicated isolation blocks or isolation stables. What you can do is to put them in the furthest stable. So, for example, you might have a stable on the end of the block that you might have empty stables where you're able to keep an empty stable between them, because obviously if the doors are positioned in such a way that the horses can lean round that are neighbours and have a little smooch with each other, that's not ideal. Some yards, again, this isn't ideal, but on some yards, for example, you could use the stable next to it as a tack room or a feed room or a storeroom so that you have a definitive separate stable. But I agree, for some it's more difficult. But really, any biosecurity procedures are better than no biosecurity procedures. So it might not seem ideal, but if you're in a box with, in a yard, with sort of American stabling, with the grills rather than the solid partitions, you can on one of the stables put the solid partitions up. You can put a grill across the door. It's not ideal, but that's. Ideally, it needs to be kept as separate as possible. And if you don't have the facility to do so, sometimes you have to go to other measures. But in terms of that, as well as separating the horse, it's important to separate everything else as well. So on the yard, if you're a full livery yard, for example, you shouldn't have your grooms, or you personally shouldn't be dealing with that with all the other horses. You shouldn't be taking the same wheelbarrow in and out the stable. You shouldn't be using the same buckets. You shouldn't be using the same tools. So that isolation area should be kept as absolutely separate as possible, with its own wheelbarrow, its own mucking out tools, its own buckets and what have you. And then obviously once that horse has finished its isolation, that stable needs to be cleaned, disinfected, and then left pristine for the next one. A lot of yards, what I'm saying does sound very extreme, which is why a lot of yards say, we can't do that. It's virtually impossible. We don't have the space. We can't give up a spare stable. But I always say that something is better than nothing. So if you can't do the isolation in the yard, try and do it in the paddock if that's possible. But at the very, very worst, you should at least be taking temperature testing and trying to keep everything as separate as possible.
It's really interesting. I knew it applied to the horse, and I sort of knew it applied to the rider, but you don't actually think about it in detail when you think about the tools you're using and the mucking out. How long would you normally need to isolate a horse for?
This really does depend on where you look for how long you need to. I believe, don't quote me on this because I'm always terrible with dates and numbers and durations, but I'm sure that the recommended time by the FEI has just been put up to 21 days. If you look on a lot of the Red Wings information on the Strangles Club, which is really useful, That says 14 days, I believe, but I think some have just increased their recommendations to 21 days. That's obviously a long amount of time. If you've got a new horse that you're moving to a yard, especially if it's just a leisure horse, you know, something that you hack out and school and have lessons on, that can be a long time before it then gets allowed to be integrated into the herd. You know, to keep horses separate, some horses anyway, it's not good for their mental health. It's not good for their social interaction to come onto a new yard and be kept separate. But obviously, if you can do it for that amount of time, that's great. If you can't, then a shorter period of isolation and combined with temperature testing can be better. Obviously, if you have horses that you're competing at a very high level that come under FEI rules, there are actually specific requirements for temperature testing and isolation. So that's, you know, if you have a competition yard, dressage yard, eventing yard, even if it's not your own horses, if there's horses that compete at that level on the yard, you may find that they have a much more extreme biosecurity policy, because obviously it protects all the horses on your yard, not just your own, and that rider will not want their string of horses to be at risk from liveries that perhaps don't compete at that level. And you know, there's no reason that they should be treated any differently on the same yard. So again, the rules will differ yard to yard, and also at the level of yard or the level of competition that you're involved in.
Yeah, I was going to mention it because I know that the FEI have strict requirements. They have an app. You have to input the temperature of your horses daily before you go, during you go, when you're away, and when you come back. So yeah, I do know that. While we're talking about competing, what should you be doing if you are going out to events? Even does it apply even if you're traveling somewhere? We go every week to our local woods to do a big hack. Is that what should people be doing? How much do they need to actually do if they're going away from home, whether that's for a short time or for a competition?
A lot of it's common sense, really. So like you mentioned, if you're just going out somewhere for a ride where it's relatively quiet and you're in the open air and there's not many other horses, then the risk is obviously going to be minimal. In those sort of situations, the main risk is probably your means of transport for getting there. If you're hitching a ride with somebody else or you're using a transporter, obviously you need to try and make sure that whatever transport, lorry, trailer, is clean, that you try and keep the horses as separate as possible if they're from different yards. The main problem is when you're going to big events. So not necessarily a big event, but where you've got lots of people with lots of horses coming from lots of different places. So it could be just a riding club clinic. It could be a local show. It could be you're off to go and do something, British dressage, British show jumping, some big championships where you stay overnight for 2 or 3 days. It's basically common sense is always what I say. So you want to try and keep your horse and your equipment as separate from everybody else's as possible. So minimize nose-to-nose contact, make sure that you're keeping your things solely for yourself, your tack, your buckets, your grooming kit, any equipment that you take with you. Don't go around greeting everybody's horse like it's your long lost friend. It may sound really unsociable, but it's to try and keep your distance. And then some things that people don't think of. So I used to go cross-country schooling a lot in Surrey, and they had a huge kind of communal water trough that everybody would use. And it used to be so busy this for cross-country schooling. And of course, everybody's first thing when you brush the horses off and everything would be to go to take them for a drink in this trough. But obviously, a communal water trough is not ideal, particularly one that's kind of just sat in the middle of a cross-country course that who knows where the water's coming from or how long that water's been sat there. And it's things like that. You have to think over the course of that week in the height of the summer, how many horses have drunk out of that trough. And you only need one strangles carrier to have dropped a lovely bit of snot into that water, another horse to come into contact with it, and there we go, there's the problem. It's just trying to keep everything separate. And especially for those that are going to larger events where there might be temporary stabling, I hear a lot of people say to me that their liveries, or they go to these events, and when they get there, the stables haven't even been mucked out, or they've got old bedding in, or they're a bit encrusted and everything. So when you're going to events like that, really the event organizers should be providing clean, disinfected stables with new bedding for everybody. Everybody should turn up with their own tools, their own wheelbarrow, their own bedding, but they don't always. So it's kind of being precautionary on that front as well if you're staying away from home. And don't just accept, there's other poo in this stable, or, there's a filthy water bucket in the corner and I'm expected to just fill it up. It's also raising the question. So if you go somewhere like that, you should be, pointing out to the organisers that that's not ideal. But yeah, it's mainly common sense, which I think, unfortunately, when a lot of people arrive at a show and they're there with all their friends and it's great fun, kind of common sense does go out the window a bit sometimes. But obviously, like I keep saying, biosecurity is in the interest of everybody, especially if you're out competing and you've got other people that compete. The last thing that you want to do is for your horse to pick up something and then to take it back to the yard, because if you have an outbreak, a yard will obviously then have to go into some form of lockdown. There'll be restrictions on movement, which could put paid to the competition season or loss of fees, vets fees. So it really, although it does seem a hassle, whether you're going to a riding club event, meeting friends with hats, going to hoys, you really need to kind of have the same mentality of what the risks are and how you can take steps to prevent them.
It's a really good point. I think you're right. People think that it's something only for people going to big competitions, but we're at a time of year where everybody's going off to pony club camp or adult camp, and it's something that they wouldn't necessarily think about. The water trough is something I would never have thought about. So you would suggest people don't even get water from the trough, they get it out of a tap.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if there's a tap, then that's going to be perfectly fine. But definitely take your own water buckets. Don't use anybody else's water buckets. And just try and keep everything separate. It's just minimising the contact with other horses in whatever means possible.
Yeah, it's really, really good tips here. And then when you get back to the yard, we've discussed some of the measures, but what can a yard owner do to protect you as a livery when you're on the yard? Obviously, biosecurity measures are key, but is there anything else that they should really be making an effort to do to keep you and your horse safe?
Ideally, each yard, whether it's DIY, part livery, full livery, whatever, should have a form of biosecurity policy. Even if it's a very basic one, it should lay out what would be done if somebody suspects that there's an outbreak. So if there's a horse showing symptoms, it should outline what the expectations are for the way people behave when they're off yard at events, so the precautions people are taking. It should lay out their procedure for new arrivals onto the yard. The most important thing a yard can do is just be very clear on what their expectations are and what the responsibilities of both parties are. So the horse owner and the yard owner, and obviously the staff of the yard owner if the yard's staffed as well. And then it just makes it nice and clear. If a horse has a sign, say it has a runny nose or it has a temperature, people should know what these signs and symptoms are, and it should be reported directly to the yard owner or their staff, and then a plan should be put in place. So, for example, some yards have the red, amber, green, which is horses that are showing symptoms, horses that have come into contact, and horses that seem clear. And it does seem very complicated, but I know a lot of yards that have used that and it works. That I believe, because I probably sound like I'm speaking foreign to some people, that I believe is on the Red Wings Strangles Hub. It explains how that works, but it's basically a way of separating the horses and determining what risk they could be at. But if you have something like that, as complicated as it sounds, it's a plan. And there's nothing worse than a horse showing a symptom of something like strangles, and then everybody becoming an expert in biosecurity, everybody speaking to Tom, Dick or Harry or the vet or somebody on Facebook who says, well, this is what you should do. And it just all becomes a terrible mess. That if you have a biosecurity policy and a plan in place, then whether it's for new arrivals, people going to events, or if you suspect an outbreak, then it's very clear exactly what the procedures are. from the get-go, from the day that you arrive on the yard, and just having open communication as well. Obviously, there's a bit of a stigma still around strangles. It then very quickly goes on social media if yards have got strangles, and it always used to be sort of hidden a little bit. You know, the horse with strangles, they'll stick them in the corner and don't mention it to anyone. And it's really good to see now that if yards have cases or suspected cases, that they're actually openly putting it out on Facebook or on their website saying, you know, we have a case or 3 cases, this is where we are, kind of, you know, this is what we're doing. If you've been for an event, so on and so forth. It's having those open lines of communication, having a plan helps protect everybody, because obviously the last thing that a yard owner wants is an outbreak on their yard, from a business perspective, not just because they obviously have a responsibility to all the equines on the yard, which are likely to include their own, but also because an outbreak on a yard can be have a massive detrimental effect on a business for its reputation, finances, people leaving, you know, if horses leave because they are put in lockdown or what have you. So it's in everybody's interests to make sure that there is definitely an open discussion and open expectations on the yard about, you know, how everybody can help protect each other, not just the horses necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially because I suppose one of the challenges is that strangles isn't notifiable. So if you have a yard case, you don't have to. It's not a notifiable disease, unlike some of the other probably bigger diseases. But I think you're right. I think some of the stigma is going, which I think is excellent. And then just finally, what do we do about visitors to yards? Because I think a lot of yards may have the best biosecurity. Should they also have a section in there about visitors, whether that be human or equine?
Definitely. This is often overlooked by a lot of horse owners. One thing I will just say is we've obviously talked a lot about people taking their horses off of the yard to compete. Obviously, in some terms of visitors, you have people coming onto the yard as well. So that might be hiring the arena, cross-country schooling, coming in for lessons and coaching or clinics. And so then you kind of have to think the reverse, and you have to think about horses and lorries and riders coming onto your premises and making sure equally that you have a policy for that, such as everybody should bring their own water bucket, restricting the access on the yard where they can go, making sure that they're clearing up poop, and just from that point of view, making sure, again, you're minimizing the contact that the horses come into with each other. Another thing that a lot of people miss out on is if somebody's listening to this and thinking, oh, well, it doesn't matter to me because all our horses are ancient, they're all retired, none of us go anywhere, we don't have a biosecurity risk. But what a lot of people actually forget is that the likelihood is that they have vets coming onto the yard, farriers coming onto the yard. And obviously those people, although the horse that they're treating doesn't go off the yard, those people will have visited numerous yards, numerous horses and ponies earlier in the day, and then are potentially bringing contamination onto the yard. So really, whatever sort of yard you're on, there will always be the risk of cross-contamination, even if your horse is, you know, doesn't go anywhere, doesn't do anything. So a lot of people overlook that. So from that point of view, regardless of what type of yard you are, you should definitely have a visitor biosecurity policy, because how many farriers wash their hands when they come into the yard? You know, a lot of them do, but many of them don't have specific practices such as cleaning or disinfecting their tools between yards, washing their hands. I mean, I always remember when, you know, when I was younger and the farriers would come out, we've all watched the farrier do your horse's front hoof, and then your horse is rubbing up all over the back of the farrier's top. And I think by the end of the day, how many horses have done that on that farrier's back, you know? And so every horse is effectively rubbing in the snot and slobber of X other number of horses. And there it is. There's the cross-contamination. So it's, you know, I mean, we're not talking about we want people to bring a complete change of clothes. It would be ideal, but you should at least have things like hand washing facilities with hot water and soap, boot dips ideally. And obviously, if you have got vets coming in, vets are potentially dealing with much more serious cases of things. So you should be asking vets especially to make sure that they're taking biosecurity procedures, and they should, but realistically, not all of them do. I hear a lot from yard owners that they're very surprised that a lot of vets come in to the yard. You know, they've been dressed in the same thing all day. They don't come in and wash their hands. So just having that thought at the back of your mind when you've got people coming into the yard. I mean, we all remember COVID. It seems so long away ago now, but we all remember the whole, you know, hand washing, hand sanitizer, stopping the cross-contamination. And it's basically the same principle. That is what we did as humans when it was COVID, is we had biosecurity procedures to stop the cross-contamination of COVID. And that ultimately is what biosecurity is for horses. You know, it's horses to horses, cross-contamination of whatever humans may have on them that could pass to a horse. It's basically just making sure that what you're dealing with as much as possible are nice, clean people and nice, clean things.
I think that last point is really, really good, because you're right. It never occurred to me about my farrier. I had a dentist come and see us, and I was really impressed with the fact that he wore a face mask, he'd washed his hands, he'd sanitized his hands. He obviously sanitized the tools he used after every horse. And I know in the back of my mind that's biosecurity, but I would never have actually thought it being formally. And I think that's a really good point. I think you have to be quite brave to suggest to your farrier that, and I think we assume that vets do, but do we, perhaps at a bigger yard, would the yard owner take on that responsibility, or is it really down to each and every one of us to do that?
I think it's everybody's responsibility. You know, whether you own a horse, loan a horse, whether you run the yard, you have a responsibility in the health and welfare and a duty of care to those equines to take steps to ensure that they stay healthy and well. In my mind, it is the yard that will set the precedent. It's more difficult on a DIY yard, but there's nothing to stop a DIY yard owner still having these expectations in their livery contracts about new arrivals, what have you, because again, even if it's a DIY yard, if you have an outbreak, it's a pain for everybody. It's not just a pain for the liveries. But the yard owner is ultimately the one that will set the precedent. So if you have a yard and you have a farrier coming on the yard and he doesn't take any biosecurity steps, then, you know, not call them out on it. That's not the right thing. But as in suggest to them, have a discussion and say, you know, we've got horses on the yard. We want to try and keep them as safe as possible and to have that barrier in place from the risks of an outbreak of infectious disease. You know, when you come, we would expect you to, at the very least, wash your hands, dip your boots, blah, blah, blah. I don't think any equestrian professional can have a problem with that, because, I mean, they obviously have a vested interest in, they don't want to go to a yard that's got an outbreak and then go to another yard, or not be able to go to yards because they've got an outbreak. Everybody has an interest in the health and welfare of the equines, whether it's a vet, a farrier, an owner, a yard owner. Everybody plays their part, and the more people that talk about biosecurity, you know, the better it is. So really, it's a collective handling of the whole thing to do what is best for each and every equine.
Yeah, I think that's really good. But in some ways, I wish we could change its name from biosecurity to disease prevention, because I think people might be more interested in preventing disease than they are in something called biosecurity. Just to finish then, if somebody's watching this and they don't have anything about this in their own yard, what would be, say, the 2 top steps they should take to start that process?
Whether they're a horse owner or a yard owner, the first thing they should do is think about what steps could be put in place. So if you're a horse owner and you don't have any biosecurity practices or policies on your yard, you're well within your right to take that to your yard owner and have a discussion with them about it. If you're a yard owner, as I've said, there's a huge array of steps, of precautions that can be taken. And again, it's about having an open discussion. So if you're a yard owner thinking of introducing these steps, thinking of how to do it sensibly, thinking of how your yard works in terms of the sort of horses that you have on the yard, the layout of the yard, the type of liveries that you have, as to how you can best implement something. That's the best thing, is to, like I always say, something is better than nothing. And the second one would just be to just use common sense. If you see something that you think is not right, if you see something that you think is a horse that looks like it might have a symptom of something, then don't be afraid to tell somebody, because obviously if you're leaving a horse out and you're kind of umming and ahhing about, oh, I don't want to be a problem, I don't want to cause a hassle, always tell the yard owner, tell a member of staff, tell the horse owner, so that the necessary steps can be taken. I think that would be my two biggest things, but just common sense. Common sense plays such a huge part in biosecurity, that I think, whether you do the simple thing like temperature testing, or where you go the whole hog and you have an isolation unit at your yard, it still all comes down to common sense and good communication.
Yeah, and I suppose primarily, as well as you've said several times, just make a start. Something's better than nothing. Yeah,
and just making sure that a yard, even if it's not biosecurity practices, cleanliness practices, good cleanliness is a good start for biosecurity. Even if you feel that's the best that you can do, encourage your liveries to tidy up after themselves, make sure everything stays nice and clean, wash buckets, wash troughs out regularly, disinfecting stables between if liveries leave and you have new liveries coming in. It's just things like that they're all very productive steps in protecting the risk or reducing the risk of infectious disease on a yard.
Yeah, and I think, as we all know, it is becoming more and more likely that we are going to get more infectious diseases in the future. So it's worth starting. And then just to finish up, I know that you run a website which is a directory of livery yards. Can people also, when they go on there, see what the yard's policies are with regards biosecurity?
They can actually. So one of the options that people can select is, there's a few that apply actually. They can have a look on there. So when people go onto a listing, there's various options at the bottom. So you can see the normal things like what packages they offer, what facilities they have. But there's also sections on there that you can see if a yard has a vaccination policy or a worming program or a new arrivals procedure or a biosecurity policy. Some yards are very open now and actually have on their website what their policies are, or will provide you with a copy of the contract or their policies when you first inquire and be very clear. But yeah, I do, like I say, I do a lot of work with strangles, so I try to normalise a lot biosecurity. So as well as Livery List, the directory, we also have a separate website called the Yard Owner Hub, which is absolutely chock full of, it's all completely free. It's full of resources and guidance. And basically, because at the moment, the livery industry is completely unregulated, really, it's very difficult. There's no specific regulatory body or governing body, so it's very difficult. I mean, like when you asked me about the duration for isolation, there's no one answer. It completely depends who you look at, whose resource you look at, amongst other variables. But what I've tried to do on the Yard Owner Hub is it's been going 5 or 6 years now, and it basically pulls together all the relevant information for yard owners in all aspects of administrative and practical yard management. It's very clearly set out in sections, and on there, for example, it has a huge section on biosecurity that covers general guidance. It covers things like yard cleanliness. You put up a link for AG Plus. Actually, we've got some on there from AG Plus as well. They're very good. Gail at AG Plus is very knowledgeable about keeping yards clean and disinfected and good yard cleanliness. And we've got a lot of resources on there from her as well. There's lots of information on there from the Strangles Hub, the Red Wing Strangles Hub. BHS guidance. There's various bits on there from Beaver, from the National Equine Welfare Council, and I've just tried to put everything together in one place that's free for everybody to access. But one thing on there that might be quite useful is earlier this year we launched a back to basics guide, and it was basically a selection of, I think it's 10 documents, and it basically breaks down simply what kind of basic industry expectations are. So one of those is for biosecurity. There's livery contracts, there's equine welfare, client management, there's all sorts on there. And that's a very simple A4 document that breaks down into easy to read chunks what the kind of basic recommendations are. So it can be linked off of Livery List, but also the Yard Owner Hub is yardownerhub.co.uk as well. And I'll just mention that I also run a Facebook group for yard owners, specifically for yard owners. It's got about 3,500 verified yard owners on there. It's called Livery Yard Owners UK Discussions and Advice, but that's really good for kind of peer discussions and peer support. So if you're a yard owner that's not sure about how to implement biosecurity policies or procedures, or how to communicate, or just general ideas around how you can manage biosecurity on your yard, that is a really friendly, supportive group, and it's linked into a lot of the resources from the hub as well. So that's definitely worth heading over to, to have a chat with like-minded people about the way that they practically implement things on their yard.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you. Yeah, so that's Cheryl's website for the Livery List, and then the Yard Owner Hub is, as you said, yardownerhub.co.uk as well. Yeah. Cheryl, thank you so much. That's been really insightful, and I think people may now realise that it's their responsibility as much as their yards, and to be more aware of what they should perhaps be expecting from yards rather than seeing it as an unnecessary evil. So thank you very, very much, and look forward to getting some feedback on this.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Claire.